You are thinking too much about cheating. If you were being cheated on, maybe you have a problem too? Like not being attractive enough. When I shared my worries, my sister laughed them off as if they were nothing. She then left me behind and headed towards the register. Alone, I bit my lip, unable to say anything. Rushing home with Nicole, who was pale and breathing shallowly, I was shocked upon arrival. At this time, the house, which should have been empty, had a car parked in front. It was Scott's company car. Tiptoeing in fear, I quietly opened the entrance door, only to find Scott and my sister's shoes there. Loud voices were coming from the bedroom. I hurried out of the house and headed to my parents' home. Dad, something terrible has happened to my sister. I.A. Kelly Brown will make sure they regret turning me and that father of ours into enemies. I am Kelly Brown, a housewife in my early 50s. My joys are reading, laughing, and making others laugh. I consider being cheerful my forte. Despite my quiet and plain appearance, I've been told I'm like a comedian when I talk. My family is the complete opposite of me. Unlike me, who resembles our father with small eyes and a nose. Patty is a beauty inherited from our mother and has always been glamorous. She has always ridiculed me for my looks. For instance, I'll never forget something that happened over 30 years ago. After graduating from high school, I was struggling with makeup when Patty suddenly spoke to me.
Ew.
You're putting on makeup? It doesn't suit you. You should just stay barefaced and blend in with the old ladies. She looked down on me without any remorse, even as I was outraged. My memories of childhood are filled with my selfish and mean sister. As we grew into our 20s, Patty became an elementary school teacher. While I was employed at a local company, she mocked even that. Well, private sector jobs have no security. I, on the other hand, am a civil servant. So my job's secure forever. Isn't that the best? Though Patty was boastful, our mother, who was also a teacher, frowned and sighed. Our father, the jokester, could turn even such situations into jokes, making us laugh. However, my heart only truly cleared up when Patty wasn't around. I fell in love 3 years into my job, at the age of 23. The man was a quiet colleague who wore glasses, named Scott. As I eagerly went on dates, I faced a barrage of sarcasm from Patty every time we met. She criticized everything from my clothes, makeup, to my taste in men. Yet, I disregarded it as usual and joyfully deepened my love with Scott. I'm getting married to Scott. I've already introduced him to Mom and Dad. You should meet him too, sometime. I announced my marriage to Scott over the phone. Then, Patty, who was still single at the time, responded in an irritated tone. Huh? Getting married before me? Unbelievable. Normally, you defer to your older sister. That's the worst. There wasn't much I could say except, I don't care. I went ahead and got married. I truly believe I was happy spending my time with Scott. Eventually, Patty got married too. It seemed like an arranged marriage, and I worried if she did it just to compete with me. Her husband, like Patty, was a teacher and seemed very earnest. Patty had children before me, and I was relieved not to receive any snide remarks then. Things were peaceful at that time. Little did I know, this peace would soon be shattered. After giving birth, I quit my job. Busy with childcare, I couldn't care less about my appearance, letting both my hair and face go. Scott began to neglect me all of a sudden. You've started to look like an old lady, he'd say and sigh as we passed each other. I wanted another child, but Scott was against the idea and wouldn't agree to it. It was a real shock, and I even considered divorce. When I consulted my friends and parents, they all listened sympathetically. On the Thanksgiving day at my parents' house, I confided in my sister, Patty, out of desperation. However, her response was less than helpful. You're lucky to have gotten married at all. If you have complaints, why don't you just divorce him now? Stop nagging. Patty said this with an air of annoyance, then fixed her makeup and went out. Left behind was my brother-in-law, looking isolated as he took care of the children. Seemingly uncomfortable at his wife's family home. While realizing I couldn't get along with my sister, I was troubled by Scott's coldness. Yet, I couldn't bring myself to leave him, and time just passed. Now, nearly 30 years later, the worries of my youth have faded into the busyness of life. And I have not divorced Scott. The romantic feelings have long since ended. But I still consider us to be companions under the same roof. After our daughter, Nicole, entered middle school, I started working as a cashier, which gave me a place outside of my home. However, the store where I worked for many years is closing. The store where I work is closing, so I'll be unemployed from next month. When I mentioned this at dinner, Scott looked up, seemingly surprised. Nicole, who had been quietly eating her hamburger, swallowed and then suggested, "That's okay. You've been working hard all this time, so why not take a break? If you quit your job, we can align our weekends. Let's go on a family trip or something." I was delighted by Nicole's suggestion. Until now, it had been difficult to align our schedules because I was busy on weekends when Scott was off. But as Nicole said, it would now be easier to coordinate. Nicole works in the service industry, so despite being a full-time employee, she can choose her holidays to some extent. After dinner, as I was washing the dishes, Scott suddenly spoke to me. It was rare for us to have a conversation, except maybe while watching TV. "So, you'll be at home all the time if you're not working? Let me know if you have plans to go out." I answered casually, wondering if he was concerned about dinner. "I don't have any specific plans, but even if I do, I'll be back by the evening." Scott nodded vaguely, showing that he wanted to know despite not usually being the controlling type. I found it odd but agreed to inform him of any plans to go out. Being a full-time homemaker after so long, I found myself with free time during the day. Just as before, I tried to enjoy my hobbies, like reading more and experimenting with cooking, but I still felt a void. Moreover, the opportunity to talk to others decreased, making me feel lonely. Recently, Scott has been coming home late. When I asked, he said his workload at the company had increased. So, I decided to visit my father, who lives about 10 minutes away by car. Since my mother passed away a few years ago, my father has been living peacefully with 2 cats. He was happy to see me when I visited with homemade sweets. "By the way, Kelly, have you seen Patty recently?" While we were having a pleasant chat, my father suddenly asked. Since we don't meet except during holidays, I shook my head. Then, my father seemed puzzled and said, "Patty now works at a school just 2 stations away, so it's close, right?" I wanted to give her some of the good pickles we buy, so I asked her to stop by after work. Then she came by in quite flashy clothes. Is that how young people dress these days? I couldn't answer since I hadn't seen the clothes myself. Incidentally, I dislike pickles, but they're Patty's favorite. Something was odd. Patty's phone rang on the table, and when I went to give it to her, she snapped at me not to touch it. She also seemed to want to place her phone face down. And when I warned her that the screen could get scratched, she glared at me. It was just a small thing, but it made me feel uneasy. That's because Patty never used to be particular about how she placed her phone. With that thought nagging at me, I went home. At dinner that day, I casually mentioned it to my family. I went to my parents' house today, and it seems like Patty is acting strangely. She's dressed flashily, and she insists on placing her phone face down. I wonder what's going on. For me, it wasn't just a feeling of discomfort, but also one mixed with worry. Then, Nicole spoke up. could Aunt Patty be cheating? I almost dropped my fork in shock. Scott choked on his soup, coughing violently. I saw somewhere that those are signs of someone cheating. There are also other signs like going out more, coming home late, and excessively checking their partner's schedule. Hearing this, I involuntarily looked at Scott. Some of the characteristics Nicole mentioned fit him perfectly. Though I thought it might be overthinking, I couldn't help but worry. Don't talk about such things outside. It's embarrassing. Scott made a grim face, perhaps noticing my gaze. The next day, I unexpectedly ran into my sister. We bumped into each other at a store near our house. "Oh, Patty? It's rare to see you here. Are you going to Dad's house?" Surprised by my sudden greeting, Patty jumped. Turning around, she wore dark lipstick and a large scarf. Her clothes were flashy, and I could understand why Dad was concerned. I had a brief chat with Patty and then remembered our conversation from the previous night. Though I couldn't directly ask her, I thought it might be okay to discuss Scott. You know, last night Nicole was talking about the characteristics of people who cheat. And well, my husband fits quite a few of them. It's surely nothing, right? I'm just feeling a bit anxious. Ignoring my sigh, Patty was choosing a drink. Then she replied lightly. "You're overthinking it. If you're being cheated on, maybe it's because you have a problem? Like not being attractive enough." I was slightly irritated by her dismissive attitude. Patty quickly ended the conversation and headed to the cashier, leaving me behind, biting my lip, unable to say anything. Several weeks later, on a Sunday, just when I had almost forgotten about our conversation on cheating, I went out to see a movie. I was headed to a new cinema a bit far away, looking forward to watching a movie in a good environment. Just as I was about to arrive, my phone suddenly rang. "Mom. I'm sorry, can you come pick me up? I feel sick." Nicole sounded in pain over the phone. I was startled. "What's wrong? Are you okay?" "I'm coming right now, wait for me." I quickly changed my destination and headed to Nicole's workplace. When I arrived, Nicole was waiting outside the building. She said she felt terribly ill due to her period, to the point of nausea. "I just want to go home. I'll go to the gynecologist later." So, I decided to head home with her. A few minutes later, as I safely arrived in front of our house, I was puzzled to see Scott's company car parked there. Scott, being in sales, might have had to stop by home for some reason during his rounds. Maybe he forgot something. He knew I would be out today, so he couldn't have asked me to receive any deliveries. Without much thought, I parked my car and entered the house with Nicole. There were women's shoes in the entrance. Not belonging to our house, these women's shoes were there, alongside Scott's. I felt a chill run through my entire body. The conversation about cheating suddenly came rushing back. I then heard strange noises coming from the bedroom. It seemed they hadn't noticed us. Leaving Nicole, who was pale not just from her condition, at the entrance. I approached the bedroom. And then, I stopped. I recognized the voices more than anyone else's. "Patty." I involuntarily murmured. Scott was in the midst of having an affair with my sister. Silently, I tiptoed back to the entrance. Leaving the unwell Nicole at the entrance, I rushed out and drove quickly to my parents' home. When I arrived at my parents' home, my father, Daniel, was just tending to the bushes in the front yard. "Dad, something terrible has happened to Patty." I pulled my father into the car. He was quite muddy from gardening, but that was the least of our concerns. As we headed home, I explained the situation to him. After hearing the story, Daniel nodded with his smartphone set to record mode. "All right, leave it to me." He brandished his latest model smartphone, bought with the ample free time of his retirement. I could guess what he was planning to do, but I didn't have the heart to stop him. Do you want to go about this seriously, or do you want to make a mockery of it? When asked, I immediately responded. Make it funny at first, please. I'm definitely getting a divorce. So I want to show them to a lawyer. We might capture 2 naked bodies. So we need to neutralize the grossness. Daniel nodded firmly. Soon, we arrived at our home. Nicole was sitting outside the entrance, hugging her knees and looking down. As we approached, she looked up and said, "They're still at it. So energetic for their age. Also, sorry, I felt so sick I threw up." Nicole seemed to be in a lot of discomfort. She had come home early to rest but got caught up in this mess instead. I felt terrible for her and patted her back as I spoke. "I'm sorry, Nicole. You can go to your room if you're able to walk." When asked, Nicole slowly stood up. I carefully opened the door, trying not to make noise. And couldn't help but laugh when I noticed where Nicole had vomited. Now, it was time to storm in. Daniel and I exchanged looks and headed for the bedroom. The sounds from inside were somewhat subdued but indicated ongoing activities. "Ready, now," he whispered to me, then flung the door open all at once. The 2 on the bed screamed in shock. We were the ones who wanted to scream. What were they doing on the bed I sleep in every night? They were in the midst of intimacy, completely naked. At least they had the decency to lay down a bath towel, perhaps to avoid soiling the sheets. If they were that considerate, I wish they wouldn't have gone through with it at home. "Whoa, Daniel." Scott was the first to regain his composure. Patty, with her smeared lipstick, frantically tried to cover herself, confused by the situation. Daniel stormed into the room, beginning his act of fury. "Patty. You. What are you doing at your age, over 50, shame on you. And Scott. You betrayed Kelly, and with Patty. I won't forgive this." Despite yelling, Daniel carefully held the camera, making it clear this wasn't just a fit of rage. Daniel has always been like that. The more he is angered or shocked, the calmer he becomes, managing to turn the situation to his advantage. But Scott and Patty were too flustered to realize this. Seeing their usually fun-loving grandfather furious made them completely panic. Daniel handed me the smartphone and pressed further. "When did this start? How long have you been doing this? Shameful, both of you." Oh. He turned bright red and spat out incomprehensible words, then suddenly collapsed onto the bed. For a moment, I worried he had really fallen ill, but he had carefully chosen a clean spot to fall, indicating it was an act. I quickly played along. "Dad. This is serious. He might have burst a blood vessel from anger. He's not breathing." While pretending to panic, I kept the smartphone camera focused on Patty and Scott. Patty was fixated on Daniel, oblivious to my recording. She turned pale and blurted out, "We need to discuss the inheritance." Scott was also pale, but he seemed genuinely shocked by his sister-in-law's words. Covering his lower half with a fallen pillow, he muttered in disbelief. "Is that really what you're worried about right now?" I agreed with him. Then, Daniel sat up with a sigh, looking at Patty, who was frozen in shock. "Patty, you're really bringing me down. That's just the lowest. How did you end up like this?" The disgust was evident on Daniel's face, not as an act this time, and I couldn't help but sympathize. As Daniel got up, Patty frowned as if realizing the gravity of the situation. While recording the shameful state of Scott and Patty, I egged them on. "That's terrible, Patty. The first thing you say when your own father collapses is that. Figures, someone who'd do such things with her sister's husband would say something different. Patty turned an angry face towards me, realizing only then that she was being recorded. As she screamed, I kept the camera on her while switching with Daniel to catch Scott, who was starting to dress in a corner. "Hey, you. Don't you dare run away. Nicole is feeling sick and just got home. It's terrible to disturb her further when she's feeling nauseous enough to vomit." Hearing his daughter's name, Scott let out a small scream, shocked to realize Nicole knew about the situation. If he regretted it being discovered, he should have thought twice before acting. The anger was palpable. Here we have two people, naked on the bed, obviously in the midst of an affair. Oh, and look at this expensive nutrition drink bottle. Seems like they were quite energized for their activity. I reported to Daniel's smartphone, playing the role of a reporter. As Patty screamed and fled the bedroom wearing only a coat, Daniel's voice followed. "Did she just leave not wearing anything but a coat?" When Patty reached the entrance and screamed again. "Ah! What is this?" I caught up to her without surprise, knowing the cause. Nicole, unfortunately, had vomited on Patty and Scott's shoes by the entrance. The women's shoes, quite elegant and seemingly expensive, were now covered in vomit. "Where do you think you're going, Patty? You're not getting away." Daniel and I caught up to the stunned Patty. We then made her and Scott sit on the floor to confess their actions. "I'm sorry. I apologize, truly." "When did it start?" "Well, about 2 years ago." Scott hesitantly spoke, glancing at Patty for confirmation. Patty, with a click of her tongue, corrected him sharply. 3 years. It turns out the affair began 3 years ago, the year Patty transferred to her current school. I was irritated by Scott's vague memory and appalled by Patty's diligent correction. "Both of you, apologize to Kelly and me on your knees," Daniel prompted, and they repeatedly apologized to us from the cold floor. Patty, in just a coat, and Scott, practically naked, made for a distasteful scene. I felt like vomiting myself. Of course, the recording didn't stop. I wonder if releasing this video to the public would get us in trouble? But it should serve as evidence. I nodded firmly at Daniel's words. Then, Patty started with a shaky voice, proposing a bizarre theory. "You can't sue family members. I'm sure, within a family, it shouldn't be a crime." Honestly, I had no idea what she was talking about. How could she say such a serious matter within a family wouldn't constitute a crime? Upon further inquiry, it seemed Patty had misconstrued some legal nuances regarding crimes like theft among family members. Still, it was clear this case wouldn't apply. Hours later, Nicole and I sought refuge in Daniel's house. We couldn't stand to stay in the house after such an incident. Now, we needed to hurry and find a lawyer. Patty was also married, so we had to inform her husband and children. It was going to be a busy time, and I rolled up my sleeves in preparation. Being betrayed by Scott and my sister, Patty, was undoubtedly shocking. The fact that I couldn't feel any hunger even at midnight was due to my complete loss of appetite. Whenever I closed my eyes, the disgusting voices of Patty and Scott haunted me, preventing me from sleeping. However, I refused to feel defeated. Instead of sorrow or despair, anger filled my heart. A few days later, I visited my lawyer's office. Showing him the video, the lawyer watched intently, taking notes without so much as a smirk. But when Patty spouted her nonsensical theory that family members can't sue each other, he couldn't help but burst out laughing. It was an interesting revelation of what amuses a lawyer. According to the lawyer, I could claim compensation from both Scott and Patty. Divorce was certainly achievable, considering the division of marital assets and the potential For my brother-in-law to also demand compensation, Scott was likely to end up nearly penniless. I also expressed my desire to inform Patty's family and Scott's parents, my in-laws, about everything. The lawyer advised that doing so after finalizing the divorce would be best. Thus, I promptly obtained a divorce application. It was to be presented to Scott once the discussions on asset division were complete. Just a week later, my divorce from Scott was finalized. Presumably, he had no arguments left after being caught on video. And he agreed to the divorce quite readily. I was the one who filed the divorce papers, while Scott went to work as usual, likely pretending nothing had happened. After filing, I visited my in-laws in the neighboring county to formally greet them and showed them the incriminating video. My in-laws, possessing decent values, were furious with their son, Scott, and agreed that it was only right for me to claim compensation. I told them, "I truly appreciate all you've done for me up to now. Nicole has decided to continue living with me. She is your granddaughter, after all, so if you'd like, please continue to have a relationship with her. However, she has made it clear she never wants to see her father again or consider him a parent. Please understand." My in-laws sadly agreed. A few hours later, after leaving Scott's parents' house, I proceeded to a prearranged meeting. It was at Patty's home. Waiting for me were my brother-in-law, who had taken a leave of absence for this, and Patty's son, who was already married and living independently. I handed them a copy of the video and included my lawyer's business card. I plan to demand compensation from Patty as well. And of course, you, as my brother-in-law, can also claim from both Patty and Scott. My brother-in-law solemnly nodded. Then, the viewing session commenced. Patty's son excused himself midway and did not return. My brother-in-law watched the screen intently until the end, tears welling up in his eyes. Patty returned home while I was still there. It was already 6 p.m., and it had gotten completely dark outside. Seeing me, Patty nearly collapsed in shock. Noticing her son from another state and her husband, who should still be at work, she started trembling violently. "Welcome back, Patty. I'll be leaving soon. Please discuss the rest with your family. Oh, and you'll be receiving a claim for compensation from my lawyer soon. Make sure you pay it. If you don't, your workplace might also get notified, so be careful." After dropping those words, I left Patty's house. As I started my car, Patty came running out, shouting something. But I was done listening to anything Patty had to say. I gave a short honk of the horn and drove away. About 6 months later, Patty and her husband finally divorced. And she paid a significant amount of compensation. Apparently, Patty resisted the divorce vehemently, leading to a court case. My brother-in-law's lawyer was highly competent, leaving Patty defeated. After the divorce, Patty was kicked out of the house and even disowned by her son. Now, she's living a lonely life, resorting to binge eating and drinking, unable to fit into her beloved designer clothes anymore. Though she managed to pay the compensation with her job, her life has become difficult. She once visited my father but quickly fled upon realizing Nicole and I were living with him. I got a call, probably about debt consultation, Daniel said, with a hint of sadness. Despite everything, Patty is still his daughter. Speaking of what happened next, there's a story about Scott and Nicole as well. Around the same time Patty and her husband were getting divorced. One evening, while we were relaxing and watching TV, Nicole received a message on her smartphone. She frowned upon seeing it and promptly blocked the number. It appeared to be from Scott, asking for her to see him. Scott, who had never done household chores, was living in a dirty house full of dust and mold since he moved out. His message mentioned his deteriorating health and finances due to eating out too much. he said he saw me and Mom walking arm in arm, looking happy, and it shocked him. He wrote that he wanted to walk with me too. Ugh. No way. Seriously gross. I want to erase his existence from my memory. Nicole shivered in genuine disgust. While Daniel seemed to miss Patty, Nicole wanted nothing to do with Scott forever. Now, here's a story about divine retribution given by chance. This wasn't my doing, but Patty and Scott ended up facing further consequences. The story goes back to when Patty and her husband were in the midst of their divorce dispute. At that time, not only Patty and her husband but also Patty's son's family were involved in numerous family meetings. Patty's 4-year-old grandson, Ben, had been watching all of these adults in their sorry state. At 4 years old, he was practically still a baby and couldn't fully grasp the situation. As a result, Ben innocently shared with his kindergarten teacher and friends. My grandma and her sister's husband were naked in bed together. Grandpa, Dad, and great-grandpa were really mad at them. Why can't people sleep naked? Is it because they'll catch a cold? The other kids found this amusing and told their families. Shocked parents likely spread the story amongst themselves. And even the teachers probably gossiped about it. The rumor spread uncontrollably, and by the time Patty and her husband officially divorced, the story had reached Scott's workplace. Apparently, a client's son was a friend of Patty's grandson. The details are convoluted, but it shows how far-reaching personal connections can be. Essentially, Scott's affair became known at his company and among clients. Scott quickly lost his standing. Being divorced for an affair is bad enough, but with his wife's sister? Finger-pointing was inevitable. Just a month after the rumors began to spread, Scott chose early retirement due to the unbearable atmosphere, cutting off his career prospects. Nicole laughed, calling it divine punishment, when she heard about this from our in-laws. Patty faced more serious repercussions. As a school teacher, she was in the worst possible position for such scandals and quickly became the talk of the town. The rumor spread from child to adult, and even to other schools, almost instantly. After receiving complaints from parents, Patty realized her actions were known everywhere. Possibly due to feeling too uncomfortable, she requested a transfer to a school in a more remote location, hoping for a quieter life. But the news of her misconduct had already reached her new posting. In the countryside, the scandal was taken even more seriously. And Patty ended up taking a leave of absence from her much-prided teaching job. Rumors caused her friends to distance themselves. And now she fears being talked about wherever she goes. She will likely have to resign. Daniel relayed Patty's complaints after she had visited him. The influence of a rumor network is frightening. There seems to be no place for the two of them to find peace. When I first heard the story, I was worried rumors about me had spread too. However, it seems I'm just seen as a victim, perceived as a serious-looking person by others. I'm grateful my appearance has saved me. 5 years have passed since that incident. Nicole and I still live with Daniel, cherishing each other in our single lives. Daniel is still full of life. And our home feels wonderfully comfortable without Patty looking down on us. Nicole seems to have little interest in getting married. Even as she steps into her 30s, she continues to work hard, living the life of a successful single woman. I thought perhaps the sorry state of our parents had an influence, but it seems that's not the case. In today's world, there's hardly any benefit for a woman to get married. There are drawbacks, especially at work. Just changing my last name sounds like too much trouble. Well, I wouldn't mind having kids, but a husband? Not so much. Recently promoted, Nicole has become quite the figure at her workplace. There's a younger male colleague who seems to admire Nicole. But it's unclear what will happen there. My in-laws maintain a good relationship with Nicole, their granddaughter. But they no longer interact with me. Since Scott has moved in with them, they've refrained from contacting us to avoid causing any trouble. After retiring, it didn't take long for Scott to truly lose his way. Within half a year, he was nearly homeless until his parents allowed him to live with them out of pity. Now, they strictly monitor him, controlling all his finances. Scott spends his days exhausted from tough day labor jobs. Struggling with his health and the cost of his medication, I've heard through the grapevine. Recently, I've started working again. I found a part-time job at a library, surrounded by books I love. Seeing students and families borrow books and leave with smiles brings me great joy. Soon, Daniel, Nicole, and I plan to go on a trip together. Deciding where to go is already an enjoyable part of the process. I'm currently living my best life, filled with contentment.